Okay, I guess everyone is in the session now. Philippe, should I start with the introduction?
Yep.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for making the time on your lunch break or part of the day to join this webinar offered by Pacific Ventury. The topic is From Myth to Misinformation, the double-edged power of stories. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Pacific Ventury and his team present today, Philippe and Hira, Philippe is the founder and CEO of Pacific Ventury Corporation. They are based in Tahiti, and they are dedicated to helping individuals and organizations to better understand the world, humanity, and tomorrow. I'm sure most of you have already met Philippe through the recent employment program for French in New Zealand, or the previous webinar he offered us on the importance of humor at work. I would like to thank you and your team for putting together such qualitative workshops and offering it to our membership. It's a real value added, and I'm sure that every time we finish a session, people go away with it with great insights and key actions in their daily life. So without further ado, I'll let you take over and start this webinar.
Well, thank you, Vincent. Thank you for the nice introduction. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this new webinar, this new session, as Vincent said, about the importance and the power that stories have into our lives. So I'm Philippe. I'm very happy to be with all of you. I'm joined today with Hira, who will do a presentation with me. So we're very happy to be here today. And same, without further ado, let's jump right in at the presentation, and I will just quickly share my screen with you. There you go. There you go. So as I said, we're talking about the importance and the power of stories today, and there's a lot to say about these stories, as you will see, and maybe you know about it already, pretty much everywhere in our lives, as the individual level, but also at the collective levels. And in the times that we are living in right now, focusing and taking interest in how stories work, how they shape our lives, our daily lives, and our future is very important, because we are all transitioning into a new world, a new system, a new era, basically. Let's put it that way. And so we're gonna have a look at all that and see how we can use stories efficiently for ourselves and for our communities to maybe take control, or if not taking control, but at least making sure that the future tells beautiful stories in the years to come. But before going deeper into that, let's share a story. So I'm gonna you back in your for you to introduce people. For that, let me just give you a few words on how to use the platform. If you're not familiar yet with AirMeet, you already probably the table. It's pretty much like a conference room in real life, right? You're sitting on the table. Once the presentation is being, then you can share and talk to each other. And when it is, then you just go back to look at the stage with the presentation. On the right side of your screen, you have a chat where you can share your ideas, your thoughts. Sorry, I'm being told that the sound is not good. Let me try to set that up. All right, let's see if this one will be better. Is anyone able to hear me now? All good. All right. Good. Sorry about that. A little bit. We have a lot of computers on the same bandwidth, so that's probably why. So I was just explaining to you how the platform works. So when you reach the platform, you have seen the presentation with different tables. That's where you are, and that's where you can interact with each other. Once the presentation starts again, then you will be looking at the stage where Hira and I are. On the right side, you have a chat that you've started to use to tell me that the sound is not good. So that was a good way for you to practice that. You have a Q&A section also. If you have any question that we will answer at the end of the presentation, feel free to write them down in the Q&A section. That will avoid them to be lost in the chat window. We will have a few polls during the presentation also, but this is very easy to use, so no problem about this. If at some point you want to say something, you want to interact with us, just raise your hand. You have the section for that as well, and we'll have you on stage to ask your question. So we're going to send you back at your tables right now, just to share your story. Tell people who you are, what is your story, and maybe why you're here today with us. And welcome back on stage with us. I hope you had time to share your stories with each other, but I know most of you know each other, so it's probably quite easy to do. So let's begin now that we're back on stage. And as I said, today we're going to talk about stories in a different level. Stories that are about me as an individual and how stories are impacting me as an individual. Collective stories, also the stories for us, how as a community, as a group of people, we rely on stories to create our communities, to interact with each other, and very much to organize the world in which we're living in. And then we'll, after Hira's presentation, that will look at how stories today have impacted our lives, we'll have a look at stories for our future. And we're here today mostly to talk about that, how moving forward, we will use stories as an efficient tool to create our future. The stories are way back from the past, and they have accompanied us all the way until today, but they will be there in the future as well. And we need to make sure that we understand how they work in order for them to be an efficient tool to build tomorrow together. So stories in general impact our lives. They relate to us, they relate to our experiences, they also relate to our emotions. And really we are bodies or entities or beings of stories. Since we are a kid, we love to read stories before bedtime. If you're a bookworm like us, then you like reading stories, fictional stories, real stories. Stories are pretty much everywhere, and they allow our imagination, without being directed, to get our mind wander, to get our mind imagine things, to get our mind asking questions, and sometimes also to consider the different scenarios that come with the story. Who are the characters? What are their lives? How are they going to evolve? And we can share different perspectives and different possibilities when we use stories to share with others. And a quick example of a story is one given by Ernest Hemingway, the famous writer, who gave us this very simple but powerful story. And I'm gonna tell it to you right now. It's a simple one, but you're gonna see that this story is able to connect with you very deeply and to allow your brain to imagine a lot of things. So here's the story. For sale, baby shoes never worn. It's hard to think about the simplest story than that. It's just a few words, but it's a story. When you read that, you're probably already imagining a lot of things. Why are those shoes for sale? How come they've never been worn? What happened to the family? Where's the baby right now? And suddenly, with just a few words, with just a very small stories, then suddenly our imagination, our brain, inspires us to think and to put ourselves in the shoes of others and in the shoes of the characters of the story. So this example just to show you how powerful and impactful stories can be in our lives. And pretty much stories are what define us also. They are the basis, the foundations of our identity. And to paraphrase Descartes, it's not that I think, therefore I am. It's I have a story, therefore I am. Without history, without a story, I have no identity. I am Philippe as I am today, and I'm not another one because of all my education, my travels, my experiences, my successes, and my failures. And my story becomes an embodiment of my identity. And when I tell my story to you, then you start learning who I am really deeply, and not just through your biases and your prejudices. And that's pretty much what happened a lot of time when we don't know people. We put on them labels, tags, category, and we don't try to understand their stories. And that's how we put them in boxes, because we don't try to go deeper and have the person tell their stories, so we can really understand who they are, where they come from, where they are talking from. And then stories are also an element that allows each and every one of us to exist as an individual and not just as a member or a category of a group. So stories are very important for that. And when you look deeper into how stories impact us individually, you realize that actually our whole body is wired to tell stories or to use stories on a daily basis. When you think about your experiences in life, you probably had good experiences, you probably had bad experiences, and all that comes within the definition of your story. But your brain has a natural ability to rewrite your own story, to use the elements of your life, but to turn them in a different angle for you to be able to bear the burden of the trauma of past experience, or just to bear the deception of a failure or of a bad experience. And this has been discovered by scientists while researching how our brain is working, and they came up with the word synthetic happiness. Synthetic happiness, what is that? It's an interesting word. It doesn't mean that it's fake, or it doesn't mean that it's artificial. It just means that it's a creation of our mind that turn the story in a different angle for us to be able to accept it or to take the experience out of it. So it's just our ability to create our own happiness by using stories to tell it differently. Let me give you an example of how synthetic happiness works. Well, it works very much as a virtual experience simulator, basically. So let's see a quick thing. Imagine that you encounter this very cute chef at the restaurant tonight for dinner. And the chef comes and tells you, what I'm going to do, I'm going to present to you my best dish. And this dish will be made of garlic, rotten fish, and strawberries. What would you think of this dish? Would you eat it? Would you appreciate it? What would be the experience that you'll have with it? Pretty much right now, you are imagining what it would make out of a mix of garlic, rotten fish, and strawberries. And I'm pretty sure that you are thinking that this experience wouldn't be the best gastronomic experience you ever had, right? And this is exactly what your brain is wired to do. Your brain is managing your experiences and is able to create the feeling and the story of what happened and what will happen just by connecting elements of your knowledge and of your past experiences. So synthetic happiness works like this. It's just rewrite the experience. It just simulates a different experience than the one you are living in. And it comes from the very frontal part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is the most recent part of our brain in terms of evolution. And that really helped us to construct our identities and to build our experiences in a way that will allow us to learn and to move forward. So basically, synthetic happiness happens when you didn't obtain what you wanted. And we come as opposition with natural happiness, which is the immediate outcome of having what you were expecting to have or what you wanted. And you probably leave those experiences back in the days where you were like, oh my goodness, this is the most terrible experience of my life. This is so difficult to sustain. I'm so sad. I won't never recover from it. And now on, when you look back at this experience, you're like, oh, this was the most important experience in my life, or I'm glad I lived that, or I'm glad this happened in my life, because at least it allowed me eventually to be here or to do that or whatnot. When you have this idea of rethinking a past experience and eventually deciding that this was a good experience, this is how synthetic happiness is working. So let me concretely give you an example of that. I don't know if you heard about this man, Maurice Beacom. Maurice Beacom spent 37 years in prison in Louisiana in the United States. He was released when he was 78 years old. So he was quite old. He spent most of his life in prison, longer than Nelson Mandela. And when he came out, he didn't become president. And he was innocented after 37 years thanks to a DNA test. So he claimed his innocence his whole life, and eventually after 37 years, he came out of prison. And when you think about that, you could consider that he came out of prison bitter, maybe sad, or maybe depressed, thinking that he wasted his life. And this is what he told people when he came out of prison. I have no regrets. It was a glorious experience. Now you can think, oh, this man probably lost it. He was so old, and it just like became crazy after this experience, and this is nonsense. And actually, no, it's just the ability of his brain to rewrite the experience lived, to be able to sustain the burden of it, and to be able to say, well, at least there's some meaning out of it. And I took the best, and my brain rewrote the story for me to be able to live with it. Another example is one from Pete Best. Pete Best was a drummer from the UK, and he was playing with a band that was becoming famous in the UK back then, and he left the band right before they went to the US to record their first album. And this band, you probably have heard about them. It's called the Beatles, and he actually left them right before they became this worldwide success and this legend of music. And this is what Pete Best said when he was interviewed a few years after. I'm happier than I would have been with the Beatles. And again, this is just not about denying reality. It's just about our brain finding the way to rewrite the story in a way that will help us to be able to move forward. And eventually, when you think about that, when you think about our ability of our brains to really rewrite our stories and to change the narratives of our life in order to move forward, in order to take the most of our experiences, then you can reconsider the way of being happy is not saying, what should I do to be happy? But pretty much, which story shall I write to allow myself to be happy? And how can I rewrite the narrative of my life in order to find happiness eventually out of any experience that I will live? My failures, my breakups, let's say I've been fired from a job. It's okay. We can now understand that our brain will always find a way to rebuild a narrative and use stories and this ability of human beings to tell stories for us to find happiness eventually along the way. And again, this is the individual part of how stories are important for us humans, but they are also very important as a collective. When you are at work and you are meeting your colleagues on the Monday morning, the first thing that you tell them is like, how was your weekend? And your colleague is telling you about their weekend, what they've done. They may have been to the beach or the forest, whatnot. When you think about it, the information that they share with you, the story that they tell you about their weekends, is quite useless for you. It has no impact in your life. It may make you a little bit envious, but beside that, you're not going to take a lot out of this information, these stories that are shared by your colleagues. Well, one thing that scientists have discovered is when we share those quite meaningless stories, it's actually the same the social use as when monkeys groom each other. It's our way to connect with each other, to spend time, to trust each other, and to tell the other, if you tell me your story, even if it has no use for me, well, eventually that will just be useful for me to tell you. I have the time to listen to you, I have the time to connect with you, and hence we are a group, hence we are trusting each other, hence we consider each other enough to do this time together. So stories also have this very important use as a social way to connect, as a way for a group to share souvenirs, to share memories. And I remember back a few years ago, I visited a museum in Taiwan about a typhoon that happened a few years back, and that was very destructive for some village in Taiwan. And the guide in the museum told us something very important. He told us resilient communities never forget. When we share stories, this is also a way for us to collect facts, to document them, to organize them in a way that we won't be able to lose them. So we tell stories, we share stories for us to be able to remember the past, remember what we believe, remember the good and the bad, and use those narratives in order for our communities to be able to move forward and not repeat the mistakes of the past. And so stories are very important for that. They ensure the continuity of our society and of our groups and help us to remember what happened and what we should do differently or what we should continue to do because it worked in the past. But if you dig even deeper than that, and then you realize that stories are actually the foundation of everything in our societies, everything in our systems. Uh, and if I ask you the question, what institution or what entity in our lives do you think is based on story? Maybe you're going to tell me, and that's the answer we very often have. You're going to tell me religion. Religions are based on stories. There's a lot of parables. There's a lot of tales within religion that help us to learn the moral codes and the social codes that religion is giving us. You may think about politics. It's an obvious one as well. Through politics, we are being told stories about what the world should be, where we should be heading, or what kind of values we want to share together. But actually, if you dig even deeper, the economy is a story. Money is a story. It's a story of trust. I trust you by giving you this piece of paper that you will give me worth the equivalent on which we agree it is. But there's nothing real. It's just a story that we tell each other. And the famous historian Yuval Harari has a good way to explain this. And he tells us we can cooperate flexibly with countless numbers of strangers because we alone, of all the animals on the planet, can create and believe fictions, fictional stories. And as long as everybody believes in the same fiction, everybody obeys and follows the same rules, the same norms, and the same values. Another way that he explains this to us, he tells us that you can never convince a chimpanzee to give you a banana by promising him that after you die, you go to chimpanzee heaven and you receive a lot of banana for all the good deeds that you've done. So give me this banana for charity and you will go to heaven. No chimpanzee will believe you when you will tell them that. And as humans, we do. We believe in stories, and because we believe in story, then we can create organizations, we can create businesses, we can create countries, all of them being based on a narrative, a shared narrative that we all agree to trust and to believe in, that help us to connect and to be able to work together. Let me give you a concrete example on those stories. Let's say you go to the bank to ask for a loan. Then you meet the banker and you have to express to the banker that well, you need the money. So what are you going to tell him? You're going to tell him your story, the story of being a good bookkeeper, the story of not wasting your money in Las Vegas, in casino, or wasting your money in beer or alcohol. You're going to tell him, well, look at my bank account. You know, I have a good job. I'm settled. I have a good house that is paid. I never been in negative on my bank account. So you just tell your story to the banker. And on the other hand, the banker is going to tell you the story of markets, the financial markets and the trends and the fact that the bank cannot trust you or can trust you for this and that reason. And all of this will eventually connect because you're going to find stories that will agree with each other. And then eventually you're going to agree on sharing money, and the banker will give you the loan saying, well, you told me a story that I trust, so I'm going to move forward and give you the money because you trusted my story of being a good bank, having like good offers for you. So all these are just stories that we share and tell each other in order to be able to collaborate with each other. And that's very proper and unique to humans. And that's deeply ingrained in our way of living and our way of lives. Now, the problem is that when those stories become fake, became false, and we are told stories that are more fairy tales than real stories, that's what happened when someone take an oath and eventually do the opposite of what they promised to do. They told the story that they will respect the rules, that they will respect the values upon which they took the oath, and then eventually they changed. And that creates some kind of dissonance for all of us, where we say, okay, hold on, this guy told me this story and now he's doing this. There's a problem there. How can I trust him? How can I trust whatever he tells me? That's the same with politics. How often are we disappointed in our politics because they told us a story for us to vote for them, and then eventually they do the opposite. They told us they'll be honest, they told us that they will care for everyone, that they will provide for the poor, and then eventually they go for corporate interest more than anything else. And so we see that the story we've been told was a fake story. They tried to disappoint us, they tried to mislead us. And that can lead to some big issues in our societies. We saw that recently with what happened in Hong Kong. Hong Kong people have been told, well, we have one country, two systems, so don't worry, you'll be free, you'll continue to be a democracy. So go on and we can work together. And Hong Kong people said, okay, we can work with China, that's not a problem. And then eventually the facts told a different story, and it erupted in riots because people told China, you just told us a false story. You lied to us because we believed in a story and you do the opposite. The same happened a few years back in 2003 with the Iraq war, when the US government told us the story of those weapons of mass destruction. And they made us believe the story until we realized that was all based on lies. That was not the real story. Closer to us, and an experience that I'm very familiar with, is the nuclear testing in French Polynesia done by the French government, where for many years, many decades, the story told was that those were clean testing. Don't worry, there's no issue, there's no impact on health, until proven otherwise. And now the narrative is trying to be maintained by some officials while the population know that the story is false. And eventually that creates a lack of trust between the people and the government or any entity that tells a story but then act differently from the story that was told. And unfortunately, as for now, we're living in an age where stories have become a powerful tool for people with maybe bad intentions to kind of misguide us or mislead us in many situations. And that creates the difficulties that we have in our communities right now, and that we're all struggling with since a few years. And I'm going to give the floor now to Hira for her to tell you more about that.
All right. Thanks, Philippe. So that whole discussion that Philippe just shared with us gives us a good entry point into what I'm going to talk about, which is something that we've been seeing more and more recently, especially since COVID has happened, is this idea of misinformation. But before we get into that, I think it's important for us to develop a baseline understanding of what we're talking about here. So let's get our definitions. What is misinformation? Misinformation refers to false or out of context information that's presented as fact, regardless of an intent to deceive. And a very common example of this that I like to share when I talk about misinformation is that it's not inherently bad. A common understanding of how humans taste different flavors is based on what can now strictly be called misinformation. This comes from a study done in 1901, when a scientist published his discovery that certain parts of the tongue taste different flavors in a different manner. So, for example, sweetness, you'll feel more at the tip of your tongue, while bitterness is something that you'll feel at the base of your tongue. And this has been reproduced over the years. It was simplified when it was shared in newspapers for the consumption of the mass public. And now, before you go looking for a candy to verify this taste map, you should know that this map is wrong. The research that the scientists worked on was actually more nuanced and but over time in the process of simplification, it has been distorted to the point now that sometimes you'll find this taste map on textbooks, but essentially it's not really true. But what makes it something that we need to worry about is that misinformation in general may not have an intention to deceive, but what we should be worried about is disinformation, which is a type of misinformation, but that's one that's intentionally false and it's intended to deceive or to mislead the population. And one example of which we can see that is, let's take a look at this example, right? This picture shows rows and rows of stray dogs who appear to be dead. This caption on this picture says that dogs around villages are being killed by the Myanmar military because they bark when soldiers arrest citizens who oppose the coup. There you go. So you can see this in this picture, right? There's rows and rows of stray dogs who appear to be dead. And the caption says, dogs around villages are being killed by the Myanmar military because they bark when soldiers arrest citizens who oppose the coup during the night. This image was going viral on social media in Myanmar recently when the military took over. But also it became common in other parts of Asia. But in light of the actual news that was coming out of Myanmar that the military is taking over, they're arresting civilian or democratic leaders, it doesn't seem much of a stretch. So a lot of people started believing that this is what the soldiers are doing, that they're killing lots and lots of stray dogs. But what actually happens is that a lot of fact checkers whose job it is to verify news, they were able to do a reverse search image of this picture. And they found this original photo, which was not taken in Myanmar at all. It's actually taken by a photojournalist in Karachi, not the same country. And the original picture shows stray dogs which were culled by the local government during a drive to reduce their population. But the edited image, what it ended up doing is that it cut the top part of the image. So that's the part where you can see the buildings, and you could have probably seen, if you're familiar with the area, that it's not Myanmar, that it's another different place. But a very simple cropping made it into a very readily acceptable piece of information that was accepted by a lot of people as being real when it was actually not. But it ended up shaping a lot of public opinion against the military in Myanmar. What's important to note here when you're looking at misinformation and disinformation is that misinformation is a more general term that includes all kinds of misleading and inaccurate information. Disinformation, on the other hand, is a subsection of it, and the one that's mostly motivated by a desire to deceive. And I know a lot of these examples that I shared are more recent, but the idea of misinformation is not at all new. The only thing that's changed is essentially our ability to share with the entire world in a matter of seconds. So human beings have been fabricating information for ages. Misinformation and disinformation, propaganda, however you call it, they have been part of human communication since at least the Roman times when Antony met Cleopatra. So Octavian waged a propaganda campaign against Antony, and that was designed to smear his reputation. And this was done in the form of engravings on these coins. You can think of it like short tweets that were etched on these coins. And this painted Antony as a womanizer, a drunk, implying that he had become Cleopatra's puppet and that he was corrupted by his affair with her. And what ended up happening was that it changed the local population's opinion of Antony, and Octavian eventually ended up becoming the Roman emperor. And this is the first account that we know of where fake news had allowed Octavian to hack a republican system. But of course, when you look at the invention of the printing press in 1493, it dramatically amplified the dissemination of disinformation and misinformation. And it ultimately led us to like this first grand scale news hoax, the Great Moon Hoax of 1835, in which the New York Sun published 6 articles about the discovery of life on the moon. And it had illustrations of humanoid bat-like creatures, bearded blue unicorns, etc. So you can see that propaganda goes back way beyond our times. But since then, catastrophes, conflicts, regime change, these are all instances where you see a lot of dissemination of disinformation. Of course, when TV and radio came into our lives, it allowed more disinformation and propaganda to be shared in real time. And don't get me wrong, this is not just some shadow organizations. There are a lot of public institutions that have used misinformation during times of crisis and during times of war. Sometimes to create chaos in enemy land, but also to deceive their own populations. For example, in 1917, you have British propaganda that was focused on demonizing the enemy, which was the Germans during the First World War. In 1917, you have newspapers like the Times and the Daily Mail, and they printed these articles that said that because of a fat shortage in Germany, which was caused by the British naval blockade, the German forces were using the corpses of their own soldiers to boil them down for fats, for bone meal, and pig food. This actually had implications during the Second World War when early reports of the Holocaust emerged. Because the public had been deceived in the First World War and they knew that these accounts were false, when the actual news of Nazi atrocities started coming in, a lot of people didn't believe them because they thought this was just another smear campaign. And again, this is also the well-known case of the Iraq War and the so-called weapons of mass destruction. This photo, I think, symbolizes essentially what Colin Powell did at the UN Security Council meeting when he sold a fake story to the world in order to legitimize war. And what these instances do is that they sow seeds of mistrust, especially if the source of information was official. Back then, our government was our own primary broker of information. You were either hearing news of what's happening from the government or from newspapers. What has changed now is that we are now in an age of social media where you have everybody has access to this. So the arrival of the internet in the late 20th century, followed by the social media in the 21st century, it dramatically multiplied the risks of misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and hoaxes. Both errors and fraudulent content now go viral because people like you and me, we share it to whoever we want without any checks and balances. So now we inhabit a world where you have computational propaganda, you have AI and algorithms that amplify fake content, but you also have people whose jobs it is, whose businesses run on running disinformation campaigns. And in this environment where trust becomes polarized around news, a lot of people and a lot of consumers of news feel entitled to choose and create their own facts, which is of course dangerous because, as Philippe showed us earlier in the session, stories are very important when we want to collaborate and continue living in a society that comprises all of us living together. So when we ask the question, who are the brokers of information? The answer is everyone. Anyone who has an internet connection is now able to share information without any checks and balances and without even making sure that what they're sharing is accurate. But don't get me wrong, social media and the internet have been a great democratizer of information, especially news. We've seen examples, right, of how governments have used propaganda to create wars, to shape public opinion. And we've seen how they've used credible newspapers and news channels to share this propaganda. And I'm not talking about straight propaganda because we usually tend to hear that, these are governments in China or North Korea who are using the television to deceive their populations. But independent newspapers, such as the New York Times, when it comes to the Iraq war, they never question American government's claims about the presence of these weapons of mass destruction. Later on, you saw the newspaper apologizing for the event, but now every time you read a New York Times story, at the back of your head, you may be thinking, but is this really some kind of propaganda or not? Or are they going to apologize for it later? So these are legitimate questions when people are not able to verify credible sources of information as well. But we have to be aware that not all information holds the same value. This is especially important when we're scrolling through our news feeds because everything comes to us in the same platform with the same scroll. What a scientist who is backed by research and expertise, when he's saying something, it does not hold the same value as someone who's just read an article online or is just sharing a one-off experience. And this can be confusing for those of us who are not very tech savvy. You can find TED Talks and conspiracy theories all on YouTube, right? So how do you check which one is authentic, which one isn't? Recently, there was a case in India where a fact checker met someone who was using a cell phone and internet for the very first time in her life. And without really understanding how technology works, this woman believed that every time she receives a notification from an app telling her something, that was actually a message from God. So now you can imagine the kind of things she would believe because she thinks that this is the way that God is communicating with her when a message pops up automatically on her phone. So it's really important for us to be able to discern, especially online, because we have so much information. And in this world of readily available information, sometimes even people like you and me can fall for fake news. And some of our online behaviors can make us complicit in this pandemic of misinformation. According to a recent survey that was conducted on behalf of the Center for International Governance Innovation, fake news is very much a global epidemic and its impact is widespread. They conducted a poll of over 25,000 interviewees in 25 countries and found out that 86% of online global citizens believe that they've been exposed to fake news. Among them, nearly 9 in 10 reported that they initially believed the news was real at least once. So misinformation is rampant, we know, but we also know that many of us have accidentally shared information that later turned out to be false. And that's more common than we think. So in a test of honesty here, we're going to have a quick poll, and I'm going to ask you if you have ever shared an article without actually reading it. So you can go ahead and click yes or no. Try to be as honest as you can. Have you ever shared an article without actually reading it all the way through? Can you see the results? No? I can see the results.
100% yes.
Wow. Okay. So I'm hearing that it's 100% yes. Thank you for being so honest. It's true. I mean, professionally, I'm trained to be a journalist, but there are times when you read a headline and yeah, I know exactly what you mean, and I would share it, and then without actually having to read it. And that's one of the reasons why a few months ago we saw Twitter. Every time you share an article on Twitter, it sends you another alert saying, "Did you actually read this article?" Which has prevented a lot of people from sharing stuff that they wouldn't actually read. So why do we share fake news? Keeping aside the network of disinformants and bad players who are making money from all of this, there are thousands of innocent internet users who add to this pandemic of misinformation, and often the reasons are much less sinister. A lot of us share fake news because this is something that we're not paying attention to. We are distracted. We just hit share or retweet by reading the headline. Sometimes we share a post because it seems to be sharing good tips on how to build your immune system. We share it because we want our friends and family to benefit from it, without realizing that we may be adding to a clutter of information that is not necessarily verifiable. A lot of times we share posts that are designed to make us feel certain emotions, right? We're either feeling angry or feeling sad. We are more likely to share something because it either confirms something that we already believe. So for example, oh yeah, I knew COVID was spreading because of homeless people because they don't shower. And look here, there's a fancy graph that's telling me this. So you're going to share it because it confirms something you already believe, or it makes us look angry, right? Let's say you know some racial or ethnic group that is being abused. And you're more likely to believe it a story if you see a video of someone abusing somebody without actually having verified that if in this particular instance this is true or not. A lot of times, a lot of these events are true, right? Racial, ethnic minorities are subjugated. They are abused in many societies. But unless and until we know it's true for every case, we may be adding to fuel to the fire. So what we're going to do next is have a little bit of an activity. So what you will see on the screen in front of you are two images. So we're going to try and see if we can learn how to spot fake news. How can we be more conscious about the kind of content, especially news, how we consume it, how we share it. So look at these two images and identify. I'm just going to give you 1 minute and see if you can tell which one of these is fake. And while you are thinking about that, maybe note down what are the indicators that helps you see which one is fake and which one isn't. And in a minute, you'll have a poll. So not now, I'll give you some time to look at these images more carefully. And then you'll have a poll in which you can choose which one you think is fake. And try not to Google it, because the point of this exercise is to see if we can identify the steps that we should be following when we do come across fake news. So if you've had a chance to look at those images carefully, you can go ahead and answer the poll. Yelaine, I think you may be onto something there. So about 40% of you think it's image 1, and 60% of you think it's image 2. Let's see. Are you ready? This is the fake image. So that's image 2. And I'm sorry if my poor graphic skills were a dead giveaway, because as you can see, people who are making fake news content, they do a much better job with the graphics than I did here. But let's see if we can see some of the clues, right, that help us see how this is fake. The first one being this barrier, the gray barrier that I talked about. The second one is the URL. That's quite strange. And if you notice closely, it doesn't even say CNN, it says CMM. But a lot of us are not going to pay attention to something like this, right? Because if we read the headline and if it's something that confirms what we already believe or what we want to believe, then we're going to just go right ahead and share that. Another thing that you want to look for in a fake news story is spelling errors or special characters. This is not how you spell marijuana. I don't think the umlaut is even part of the Spanish writing. So that's one clue right there. And the last clue, which is a little harder to spot, I'd be curious to know if some of you got that, is this one, right? Apart from the dubious claim that this headline seems to be making, the fact that it's attributed to an agency that would definitely not have any expertise on the medical effects of marijuana. So watch out when you come across news that cites global agencies. Are they really experts on this topic? Is UNESCO really qualified to give health opinions, for example? But even, so we know that this is fake, and in some ways this was quite obvious, right? A lot of times fake news wouldn't be as obvious like this. But even when it comes to the original image, right? The one that is actually true, that's a screenshot from a CNN news report. We have to be a little bit more critical when we're consuming news from authentic sources of information. Some of the questions that we could be asking when we read this report is, okay, so who funded this research? What was their sample size? What are they basing their findings on? Who is benefiting? Who is losing from the findings of the study? So these are some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves when we come across information that we may not always be able to verify. So in the end, I'm going to share with you a quick checklist on how we can practice information hygiene, because given the importance of how stories and information is for the functioning and the peaceful functioning of our society, it's very important for us to practice information hygiene. So one of the first things I would say is to stop and think. Before you hit forward or share on anything, stop and think if it's accurate. And if you have a little doubt, don't pass it along. The second thing would be to check your source before sharing with someone else. Ask yourself where this information comes from. You should trust information that comes from reliable sources, newspapers, professional associations, etc., but not always. A very good example I saw recently is for medical information, right? We know that medical community sometimes has a bias against ethnic groups or against women, for example. A lot of women's health problems aren't reported. So in those cases, we may have to resort to unusual sources of information. But we have to be sure that our information sources are diverse and we're not falling into one trap. Ask yourself, could it be fake? For screenshots especially, do verify with an actual website. So I know I didn't allow you to Google, but the best way for you to check this CNN screenshot would be to just Google the story if CNN actually published it or not. Again, if it's not true, if you're not sure whether it's true, don't share it. If you hear yourself thinking that, oh, I'll just share it in case it's true, a good option would be to not share it at all. And try to see if you have a list of things on a piece of information, check each fact individually. A lot of times we saw this, especially with COVID information, that disinformation is buried within multiple claims. So the top 3 claims would be accurate and factual, and then the rest would be completely false. But when we all lump them together and share it, we sort of legitimize even the ones that are not true. I mentioned this before also, we should be aware of emotional posts. If a post is making you angry, fearful, emotional, then you should be a little bit more careful of whether or not it's authentic. And think about biases also. Ask yourself, is it something that you're sharing because it's true or just because of something that you agree with it? So in the end, the conclusion is that to be better storytellers, we have to consume news more responsibly so that we're able to tell better stories for our future. And with that note, I'll pass it on back to Philippe. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Hira. So this being said,
Sorry.
this being said, and I'm pretty sure that you related to a lot of things that Hira shared, and in the period that we are all living in, there are questions on how we're going to use stories in the future for the time and the challenges that we are all living in, and climate change being one that we can think about right now. As COP26 is being happening in Glasgow, and we're trying to find a common ground and common stories to tell about our futures and what kind of future we want. So just to close in before moving on to the questions, because I've seen that you've all asked some very interesting questions, and we'll be happy to answer that. Let's talk about the future and how we're going to use stories in the future in a way that will be positive and help us to move forward as a community and as a collective all together. Because we are, as I said at the very beginning of this presentation, we are in a new normal. We are in a new era. We are living in a world that is not the same that it was 2 years ago. And you probably heard a lot about this expression, the new normal, the new world, what's going on after. We have the pandemic, we have climate change, we have all those what we call existential threats that you probably have heard about, and that are the main topic of research in many situations. So what stories do we need, and how do we tell stories after having lived these difficult times where stories have been used as tool to divide instead of tool to connect and to gather people together? Or a few steps to take in order to rebuild the stories and to build stories for the futures is, first of all, to share our stories. At the very beginning, I asked you to introduce yourself and just to tell your story. Who are you? Share your story to people. We are always deeply, because stories are here with us since a long time, we are all deeply interested in stories from others. And so share your story with your communities, with other people, and mainly those who are different from you. So we make sure that our stories are understood, are known, and that we help each other to take a different perspective from our own individual point of view, which is very often what we use, right? And what we say is like, it's my point of view, so I'm going to share it. Yes, but learn about the story of the other, learn about the point of view of the other. And why this point of view exists is because there's a backstory to it. And if you know the backstory, then you'll be able to understand why this person is thinking or doing what they think or what they do. And obviously, if you share, be willing and be ready to listen, to pay attention to each other's stories, because in stories there's wisdom, and not only knowledge and information. And this comes from the very famous Turkish writer Elif Shafak, who distinguish information, knowledge, and stories. And information is just a set of data, of facts. When they are put together, they become knowledge. But when you add the personal touch, the emotional element of it, the storytelling aspect of it, that's where you build wisdom, because that's the experience, that's everything that we live through those information and those situations that help us to gain wisdom. And finally, teach the stories of your past. Make sure that people know where they're from, know what's the context, know all the elements of our past histories, because that will avoid us to repeat the same mistakes. I used to say that story or history doesn't repeat itself, but it kind of have the tendency to stutter. And once you know the past and you avoid this stuttering, that is sometimes plaguing our communities. And this element is important because that will allow us to build inclusive stories, not my story, but our stories, going from the I to the we, and allow us to really build stories that will help us to move forward in the times to come. Because if you look at the news right now, you are pretty much divided between a world where humanity is no longer, because climate change has wiped out everything on the surface of the earth and we are no longer able to survive. You've probably seen this press conference from the government of Tuvalu last week, where they were doing the press conference in the water. And they are right now thinking of how we maintain a country, how do we maintain a national story when there's no longer any country to live on, right? And it's a difficult situation for them, and that requires a story that include people and include the elements that are necessary for our own survival. On the other hand, the other type of story that we hear about the future is the future of machines. And you probably watched this TV show, Black Mirror, that describes us an apocalyptic future where machines very much take over and control us, and we are bound to be put on the side of history, on the side of our own lives, to our own misery. And sometimes when you hear some businesses, some government, they tell you, well, we move forward to a world of automation, and where are humans in there, right? And so we need those collective stories in order to put back humans in the center of our future stories and to help us gain hope and positivity in whatever is happening. And as I said at the very beginning of this presentation, stories are important because they connect us with each other. They allow us to not feel lonely, to not feel alone, because we share common stories, we share common narratives, we share common experiences. And we use that by using storytelling to make sure that we connect with each other. And that's very important, because think about climate change. If I think about climate change from my individual perspective, from my own personal story, what this is doing, it's me facing the strengths of elements that are beyond my control, cyclones, heat waves, and all that. For me, as an individual scale, is just unbearable, and I can definitely lose hope if I think about my story in the future as an individual story. But if I start thinking through inclusive stories, stories that connect and gather people, then it becomes the history of a species, of a whole bigger group that has evolved, that has adapted, that has faced many challenges since many centuries and 1,000 years ago, and is still here today. And so I'm just an element of this bigger story, these very long stories of millennials that have seen our species being able to adapt to any challenges. And if I put myself in this collective narrative, if I use stories to gather people and not to divide them, then I build a future where I feel more secure because I feel less lonely, right? And when we think about the future, sometimes the future can be quite scary. We don't know what's going to happen to us and in a very short term now. And so we need to build stories that will bring us hope. And hope is a key element. It's an emotion. It's something that as humans, we need to sustain, we need to maintain, we need to nurture. And hope comes with stories, because as the former Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia was saying, hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. And stories are important for that, because they are the tool that help us make sense. We put everything in a context. We build a narrative that help us understand and use synthetic happiness to say, okay, this was not what I was expecting, but I take something out of it. Eventually, as Maurice Buchan told us, it's going to be a glorious experience. Climate change seems dooming, seems terrible, seems like apocalyptic, and you're like, we're all lost. Let's just give up right now. No, because synthetic happiness help us build story that will help us to gain wisdom on the long run. It's going to be tough on the moment, but eventually we will tell stories of hope, stories of inclusion, and stories of possibilities for the future. And that's how stories are so important. So I'm going to leave you with two questions. First one is, what kind of future do we want to live in? And then once we've decided the future that we want, is what kind of stories do we want to contribute to? Are we going to use the stories that divide us, as what's happening right now in our world, as Hira described to you? or we're going to try to build more inclusive stories that gather people and get them all together. So that's what we wanted to tell you today about stories. And if you're interested in stories and how to look beyond those misinformation and those disinformation, let me quickly introduce to you two products of ours that we use to help people understand what's going on in the world and help make sense and build a narrative all together. These are free, so we are very happy to share them with you. These are weekly newsletters that we are writing for you. This is a different kind of storytelling, but it's storytelling as well. And if you're interested to learn what's happening in the world and get it from a perspective that is ours from the Pacific, because in New Zealand, you're part of a regional family of the Pacific. So if you want to make sense of all this and understand the stories that are being told today and the stories of the future, feel free to subscribe. It's free. We have one in English, one in French, so pick up the language that you prefer. There on the screen, the last issues that we done this week in French, we talked about West Papua. There's issues of narrative also and stories being told from different sides that need to reconnect with each other. And in the English version, it was about Taiwan, where also here we have issues of narratives. Is it part of China, and does it fall into this national narrative or not, or is it something very different? So feel free to subscribe. You're more welcome to join our community and also to share stories with us in that aspect. So that's all for our presentation. We're going to turn now to the great questions that you all asked, and I'm going to take the first one that I think is the most oriented towards me, and the rest will be for you, Hira. But the first question is from Frederick, who was telling us, in the case someone is not interested in some of his or her colleagues talking about the weekend, what they buy online, which restaurant they tried, or food they like, etc., what should this person do? That's a very interesting question, and I can feel there are sometimes some frustration coming out of it. Well, as I said at the beginning, you don't listen to gain good information out of it. You listen because you care. So if you care about your colleague, just let them talk and share their stories for a few moments. And if you don't care about this person, then just tell them that you have more interesting things to do in a very polite way, obviously. But again, those talks, those what we call small talks, and I'm no good in that as well. But small talks are important to tell people I care, and I give you some time just for you to share with me whatever you want. It's useless for me, but because I care about you, then I will listen to your story. And next time, hopefully, you'll listen to mine, even if it's useless to you as well. So really, the question you should ask yourself is, do you care about the person sharing that with you? And if you do, then just give it a bit of time to show that you care. Here, I want to answer the other questions.
All right, thanks. So I'm going to start with the order that I see them here. Yolaine, I'm reading your question. How can we verify the source of information when anything can be faked? So thank you for that question. And that's true. I mean, especially now with social media and internet has basically brought the entire world's worth of information to just like one click away. It can be pretty daunting. But thankfully, the fact that we have so much misinformation also means that now a lot of professionals agree that this is a big problem. So now, as much as misinformation is rampant, fact checking is also rampant. You have organizations, professional networks of journalists across the world who are working professionally to verify news and information as it happens. I'm sure you have fact checking sessions. Departments in most of the major newspapers that you follow in your country and internationally as well. So that's one good way to know that a lot of the fake information that comes that becomes so popular that it becomes a public concern. A lot of the fact checkers you'll see will go and do the job for you, that they will verify it, they'll go back to the primary source. But as individuals, I think what we can do, and that's something that I try to do myself, is to expand our sources of information. Try to get your news and information from a variety of sources. So, for example, if you are based in New Zealand, for example, it's no longer enough to just be reading the New Zealand Herald, for example, to get all your news, right? It's important to hear what the Australian newspapers are saying about what's happening in New Zealand. It's important to hear what newspapers in Fiji, for example, or the other Pacific Islands are saying. When it comes to trends or information that's global, we can try to see it from different perspectives, right? One good example would be recently what we saw, the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. It wasn't just enough to be reading about that in the New York Times or the Guardian, right? Because that comes with a filter of Western governments' understanding of that crisis, right? It's important to hear what Afghan newspapers are saying. And with the internet now, it's possible. Like, English is a global language. Most countries in the world now publish something or the other in English language. So I think it's important when you're looking at information to try to expand the diversity of our sources. And that is one way for us to verify the information that we're seeing and try to, at the end, I think we can be the best judge, but I think we are better judges of the information when we expand our own knowledge of these events. I hope that answers your question. But so maybe you can elaborate your question. I'm not sure I understand completely.
Yeah.
What you're asking.
So we are consumers, and as consumers, we define what's available on the market. And when we stop consuming something, it has an impact on what's available. So on information aspects, my question is more, by not clicking on certain news, will that influence as consumers what's available in the news? Because nowadays I'm frustrated that even in good sources like Courrier International, all my morning news are focused around COVID or same topics. And I'm thinking, is that because people click on it? Whereas I'd like to see breakthrough about science, other political concerns, or laws that's passed and that very important. Do you think we have a power as consumers when clicking on news to make the difference and change what's available?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, and I think it's an important question to ask because we think that as consumers we have a lot of power over this, but I think with social media we forget that this is not equal power on both sides when it comes to consumer behavior. It's not like we are buying something because we like it or we need it, right? It's not the same consumer behavior as you would to buy sneakers or the latest fashion item. When it comes to information and when it comes to social media, the algorithms are not designed in that directly proportionate relationships. The algorithms do amplify content that gets most engagement, which is a vicious cycle because then people are tempted to create content that's going to get most engagement. And the content that gets most engagement is the one that's polarizing and the one that's trending. So right now, because a lot of people sorry. So with technology, I think that relationship with algorithms is not as linear as we would like to be. So I don't think a lot of times just by not clicking something, we can influence the algorithms because a lot of times even these social media companies don't understand how these algorithms are presenting something on our news feeds. So I think that's a bigger question. And I think a lot of countries are now realizing that that's a bigger question that they should be asking. You see a lot of checks and balances about what Facebook does and how much control they have over their news feed. So the right questions are being asked now, but I'm not entirely sure if it's the same kind of consumer behavior relationship as you would expect with other kind of products. Does that answer your question?
Definitely, you were right on it. Thank you.
All right, so I see Mary's question. Is there a magical key to pass this way of thinking to our kids? What kind of thinking? How can we help?
I think this was asked when you talked about the right information to choose, fake news, or how to be critical in regards to this information.
Okay. Yeah, again, very great questions. I mean, and these are the questions that I think that the more we ask, the more we can do something about this. I think I do firmly believe that news literacy and how to consume news is a basic skill that everyone should be taught in school. I think our education system needs to go beyond the point where we think of social media and internet as a pastime, or that's something that we do as a way to relax. Right now, digital lives and digital presence is becoming more and more important in our lives. So we need to have the right tools to be able to navigate those spaces. So I do think that consuming news and verifying information and figuring out what to believe or not, what we see on social media or on the internet, is something that should be taught to kids, as important as learning how to add and subtract and multiply. That's my opinion. How much our education systems are willing to adapt to this, that remains a question.
I'll add some things, and indeed, Mary detailed us that we had to get the first question she asked first, but I'll go with it. And so your first question, Mary, was how can we get our head around misinformation so we can truly be happy with our lives without telling us they're messing with us, taking us for idiots while they do their little business? What is the key to remain peaceful and serene? That's a very important question, especially in those times of crisis, indeed, and how to help your kids then get the right mindset around that. And I think what Hira said is an important answer. But what I will add to that is I think it also comes from our own biases, right? And I was talking about that at the beginning about our point of view, and sometimes things seem simple from our own point of view, or we try to make sense by taking some elements and trying to find a whole connection to it. So I think we have to remember that no one is perfect, and there's not always a bad intention in the information that are shared with us. There are some, and here I talked about that, but sometimes it's just that we don't go deep enough, or we don't try to understand enough. So I think the first thing is to make sure that you don't always try to think there's a hidden agenda in anything. Sometimes it's just that people are not as competent as we think they are, or they just don't see the whole picture as well, and they just can be mistaken. And that gives us a little bit of distance before going to the next step, which could be, okay, they are lying to us, or they're hiding something, right? And I think that's the difference between asking questions and being defiant. Asking questions is always good. Be curious about what's happening. Try to find a different source. Try to change your perspective to understand what's happening. But never starts from the point of defiance, which is to say they lie to us, hence I'm gonna try to prove that they are lying to us, right? So we have to, at some point, and this is, we don't have time to talk about this, but this is a basic element of a leadership framework that we work with at Pacific Ventury, which is invitational leadership, and which calls us to think that everyone has a positive contribution to make, and not everything comes from a bad intention at first. There are situations where it is, but not always. So we need to first take some perspective. And in that element, I think getting your news from different sources, and mostly from different geographical places, is important. If you follow, all of you are French, if you follow the French news, don't just look for news about France from the French media. Look it from US media, UK media, Chinese media, or whichever. because you'll see the news from a very different perspective, and that will help you to get a distance from what we sometimes tend to hear in the mainstream media in France about France. And so gaining perspective is very important for that. And that leads to the second element, and how to help your kids get this good mindset. I think tell them stories, but different stories. Tell them stories from different countries, from different people, expose them to those other narratives, to the other stories. Buy them books or show them movies from different countries, from different people. And the more they learn how to put themselves in the shoes of others, the more they learn to take perspective and to never take things for granted, and to learn to take things with a grain of salt, but not too much, and to find the right balance, to not be exhausted by what's happening. Because unfortunately, most of the time when we get too much into the negative or in the defiance, then we withdraw and we stop caring about what's happening in the world. And that's when our communities start to struggle to find unity and to get together, because we just then eventually look for narratives that are good for us or that resemble what we think, and that's when it becomes dangerous. So yeah, just take some perspective, and if at some point then there are good evidence that they are messing with us, then that would be the time to hold them accountable, and we have tools for that. So let's just do that. I don't know if you want to add something else. All right. Well, I guess we are reaching the end time of our sessions. I know some of you are on your lunch break, so we don't want to go too much beyond that. Vincent, maybe if you want to get the conclusion, we'll just, before that, we're just going to thanks everyone for joining us today. It was great to share this moment with you, and I hope this was helpful for you to make sense of stories and how we are living with them. And I look forward to meet everyone in other occasion, maybe.
Thank you very much, Philippe and Hira. It's fantastic to have such critical and insightful content. Hope the ones that attended today get many elements and information out of it that will help them in navigating through all the information we have. Want to thank you especially since it's public holiday for you, as you're on the 11th for Armistice, as we discussed at the beginning of the call. And thanks for making the time on such a day that would be a day off for you.
No problem.
Well, enjoy the rest of your day.
Well, thanks everyone for joining.
As recorded, we'll definitely share it with our audience so that more people can have these insightful moments.
Definitely, and thank you, Vincent and Mario, for organizing all this. It was fun. Good day to everyone, and good weekend. It's Friday for you, so enjoy your weekend. Hope the weather is good in Auckland. We're sending you some warm sun from Tahiti, and hope to see you soon.